The G20 presidency is very important for Prime Minister Modi, for India. There are billboards, hailing India as the G20 president all across the country. You cannot miss it. On these billboards, India is projecting itself as a Vishwa Guru or a leader of the world. And Modi, of course, is on all those posters as well. All this is important for Modi because India goes to the polls in 2024, so next year, and Modi would like the momentum from the G20 and his projection of himself as a statesman to carry him into his third term in office. So both for the international standing of India and for the domestic audience, this is a very important moment.
All right, good for him to be seen as a statesman on the global stage, I guess. And Nikita, just one more thing. So he would have liked this to have been all about his agenda as opposed to what it became, the war in Ukraine.
Absolutely, which is why both the Foreign Minister of India and Mr. Modi have made references to India being the land of Gandhi, of the Buddha, who taught us to agree, even if you disagreed on many things, to have common ground, to come to consensus. And that's very much speaking to the constant backdrop of this G20 summit, which is, of course, the events in Ukraine and Russia. So India would have liked this to play out very differently, of course.
Of course. Vicky, if I may come to you. So Prime Minister Modi had his agenda, as the champion of the global south, as they say. But the Ukraine war was always going to be the focus here, given the divisions there are.
Well, absolutely. And we expected that to happen. I mean, nevertheless, there has been considerable discussion on other things as well. I mean, the focus, as we know, for this G20 meeting was to talk about cooperation in particular, so multilateralism. Because, of course, we've seen a lot of that disappear during not just the COVID period, but also since the war in Ukraine. Food security, I mean, all these issues and climate change, too, which affect particularly the developing countries and the ones, of course, that Modi wants to focus on. So their discussion is there, but whether, in fact, there is any conclusion that can come, of course, we have to wait and see what more may be happening when there is a proper summit later on. But that is one of the concerns, of course, that we're talking about it. But what it means for the developing South, if you like, or the global South, is pretty worrying, in fact, looking ahead.
And there's this, Vicky, there's this difficult balancing act in a sense, isn't there? Because the bottom line is that India cannot afford to alienate either Russia or the West.
No, absolutely. And of course, we've seen that India has not been willing to condemn what Russia has been doing. And there is a considerable concern that, all the sanctions that have been imposed by the West on Russia may not be working, mainly because a number of countries are continuing to operate or perhaps even pass goods through their own borders to Russia, rather than the sanctions, of course, working the way that they were meant to be. And there is also concern that quite a lot of the sales of things that Russia cannot sell, such as oil to the West, are now going to places like, and gas going to places like India and others. So there is a bit of a split that's happening. So we're talking about multilateralism, but actually what has been happening in the last year or so has moved us further away from that. And I think if there were any chances of the G20 really focusing on that, but perhaps with Modi in charge, or at least with India in charge of G20, that may not happen.
Chris Weaver, let's take Vicky's point on this lack of condemnation from India of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the fact that it buys oil at a discounted price and then sells it on. How much of an issue is that in multilateralism? How much of an issue is that as far as India's other partners are concerned?
Yeah, well, potentially it is a major issue, because at the core, you can see that what Russia is doing, selling oil in particular at a discount to countries like India, it is shifting economic competitiveness, and certainly in energy-hungry industries, from Europe to countries like India to Asia. We have some examples. BASF, of course, a big German chemical manufacturer, saying that they are closing down operations in Germany because of the increasing cost of energy there, and are likely to reopen in India or maybe Turkey or other countries. And one of the reasons is, of course, they're getting kind of cheap energy from Russia. So yeah, I think the longer this goes on, the more of this kind of divide and resentment rising at a political level we'll see. But also, of course, while Moscow has never so specifically asked for political support from countries like India or the other Asian countries, even in Turkey, it is acquiring that kind of, I won't say support, but lack of condemnation, maybe, the fact that they abstained at the votes in the UN. It is getting that position because it is providing these kind of economic advantages, in other words, cheap energy, cheap oil, cheap coal, and eventually cheap gas. So indirectly, Russia is able to rely on this quasi-support, certainly lack of condemnation from those countries at a time when Western economies are feeling more and more pressure, economic pressure, because of the impact of the war. So I think this was always going to come to a head this year. It was always going to come to a head at the G20 summit in September. And I think between what happens now, between now and say the September summit, is going to be very critical as to what the world will look like in terms of this divide. Will we get a divide, or will there be some common ground?
That's it. And Nikita, when Modi says multilateralism is in crisis, he's not wrong, is he?
Yes, so Modi, loves to hate India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was from the opposition, the current opposition Congress party. But India, right from independence in 1947, has championed the cause of non-alignment. This was, of course, in the shadow of the Cold War, where India and other newly independent countries like Indonesia or Egypt, wanted to be non-aligned and not with either the first, so-called first world led by the USA or the second world led by the then USSR. And in a way, India and many global South countries are continuing in that tradition, saying the world is now very different. It is not a unipolar world where the US and the Western Bloc can, set the agenda for us. And therefore, we want reform of major global institutions like the UN. And we want to be a multilateral, multipolar world. So, that's a consistent line India has had. This moment is no different.
I wonder, Vicky, when we talk about non-alignment, as Nikita just alluded to there, but in fact, India is aligned to Russia, isn't it? In the sense that it is taking its oil, which is coming at a cheaper price because of the war. So, it's basically supporting the war effort, you could argue.
Well, it's interesting because that is happening on the one hand. On the other, what you're seeing is that quite a lot of countries in the West are trying to have closer trade ties with India. Maybe it's a reaction, but the UK is talking about it more. Europe is talking about it more. So I think there are active efforts to reintegrate, if you like, India in the Western orbit, if that is at all possible. And India's interest must lie in being able to export and do business and get a lot of investment from the West. So you'd imagine that, that happening in parallel, if you like, maybe acting as a counterbalance to the other tendencies that we have seen recently towards Russia.
When Modi says, Vicky, that we should not allow issues we cannot resolve together to come in the way of those that we can, you do wonder what issues there are that can be resolved in the current climate.
Well, there is quite a lot going on right now on the trade front. I already mentioned, of course, what's happening in terms of trying to have closer ties with India anyway. But there are issues in terms of various countries and some big countries like the US, looking at sort of having a competitive advantage in the climate change front. So with a lot of subsidies for businesses, in fact, developing and innovating in that area, on the US itself, so on the ground, rather than doing things elsewhere. So you're already seeing a move of production. We heard earlier about moves towards India with cheaper oil, but also in terms of subsidies that exist, them going to the US as well. So we've seen that happening in Europe, and Europe is reacting by doing something similar itself, or at least talking about it. So there is an issue about what can the institutions do to ensure this multilateralism, if you like, is maintained. And the WTO itself is an institution that people have talked about for quite some time in terms of needing reform. It seemed to be getting a few more teeth recently, but those are aspects in terms of international competitiveness and any unfair practices. If those can be deemed to be that those institutions should be looking at to ensure that at least there is, both in terms of investment and trade, the moves which help the world economy overall, rather than just end up in silos of subsidized nations that can afford to do so, leaving loads of others disadvantaged. So there are those issues that I think can be discussed and perhaps should be discussed.
And indeed, Chris, this focus on the Ukraine war is taking attention away from those crucial issues that we've talked about of the global south that needs focus: food security, climate change, and so forth.
Yeah, it certainly is taking away from those issues, but it is brought back onto the table other issues, and we talk about the if you like, the resentment in developing economies, in Asian economies in particular, over the fact that when the climate debate kind of really gained ground or gained prominence a few years ago, there was a great deal of resentment in countries in Asia that the West, which had used or disregarded the climate to develop their own economies, to industrialize and to become great economic powers, they were now preaching to Asian and to developing economies that were only further down the process. And now, we can see that Russia highlighting, if you like, what it refers to as the dominance of the West, of the US and big institutions like the UN and World Bank and IMF and others. This whole debate over, the kind of what should be the relationship between developing economies in Asia and the developed economies in the West. There needs to be a better balance. So if you like, while specific discussion about how to kind of reduce carbon emissions and specific issues about climate have taken a back seat, the whole question of equity and of kind of a balanced relationship between West and developing East is very much back on the table. And the war in Ukraine and what Russia's been saying about the kind of the Western kind of influences, well, I think has brought these tables back on, about these issues back onto the table. And if we're not careful, then I think the end result will be a much greater divide between East and West, rather than, bringing both sides closer together.
Do you agree with that, Vicky, that it could lead to a much greater divide?
It could, and I think one has to work very hard to ensure that that doesn't happen. And of course, what it does require is quite a lot of transfer of resources from the West to those countries that now need a lot more support in order to adapt to climate change and also not lose out, if you like. And we know that there are various regions in the world which will be particularly affected with temperatures going up. So there is a need to do that. There have been pledges, of course, a number of times. So the G20 itself sort of has been very behind those suggestions, but the money hasn't quite made it yet. So I think we need to push a lot harder in that area. So there is no doubt that there is a lot that the West needs to do to satisfy that balance, which we absolutely need to see happen in the future. Otherwise, I think we will be splitting up. And of course, the spheres of influence will therefore also be such that, the world will be much more difficult to control, in terms of progress in that area to control.
Yeah, but Vicky, in terms of progress, it's very difficult to make any progress on all the levels that we've been talking about while this war goes on, isn't it? Given the divisions that it's created.
I'm afraid so. So, obviously, we're all keeping fingers crossed that there could be some resolution, but if anything, we're looking at more escalation. Underneath all that, though, we have to bear in mind that there are some good news for the world economy as a whole, and that includes the fact that, in fact, energy prices have been coming down, and gas prices in particular, food prices, which of course have been particularly worrying for the developing world, are also coming down, have come down for the last 10 months. Whether they've been reflected yet in terms of what people are paying on the ground is a different issue. So there are some good news, and the world economy is likely to do better than had been originally anticipated for 2023. But for the developing countries in particular, what is also, of course, a concern is that partly, trying to support their own populations through the health scares we had. And also get the economy moving again, they have been borrowing more. So again, thinking about what the world institutions could do, the international institutions could do. The World Bank, IMF, and so on, the support that needs to be given has to be significant so that we don't end up with loads of countries defaulting. There have been signs of that, of course, already happening. So there is a lot that can be done despite, the hostilities and the conflict and the war still going on in Ukraine.
Nikita, what's your take on this? How do you think where we're at right now in 2023 could shape the world order, could perhaps lead to reform of the institutions?
It's an interesting million-dollar question. Like the other speakers have said as well, the G20 should have climate change at the center of its agenda and not be overshadowed by the war as it has been. In the last G20 round, which happened in Indonesia under Indonesia's presidency, there were agreements on climate change, despite the Ukraine war already being 5 months in. And the US in particular signed, with much fanfare, a just energy transition partnership agreement worth something like $20 billion with Indonesia. And that can be seen as progress and something that, India would look forward to as well. But when you start really looking into these mechanisms, much of those, $20 billion is in the form of loans, it's tied aid. It is very much in competition with Chinese investments in Indonesia in their area of climate change. While there are lots of areas, fuel, food, vaccines, public health, climate change, where the global south and the more advanced economies should be working together in fora like the G20, those need to be on a much more equal footing than what we have seen so far. So we can hope that the G20 advances these critical agendas, but that's a big question mark.
Yeah, I was just thinking that as I was listening to the other two speakers, that this summit in September is going to be hugely critical. And we have become used to the G20 perhaps focusing on major issues like climate and poverty. But really now it's become much more about almost, I hate to put it simplistically, but like West versus East. I mean, this fracture that you've been talking about between the developed economies in the West and the developing economies mainly in the East. And I think this is a huge issue now, accelerated and exacerbated because of the war. And of course, President Putin is continuing to pour fuel, literally, onto that fire, specifically on this divide. And if we do not get some sort of a resolution, if we don't step back from this increasing fissure or gap in September, it is going to get wider. Because remember, the next two G20s will also be in BRICS countries. The next year it will be Brazil, the year after it will be South Africa. So if you like, the BRICS countries now have control over G20. And if we end this summit in September with a much greater divide or more obvious divide between developing and developed nations, then I fear that gap is going to get wider and wider under the next two G20 stewardships, because they are BRICS countries with exactly that agenda of looking to make the world kind of more balanced. So I think for me, the key point of the summit in September, unfortunately, won't be what President Modi would have liked at the outset. It will be partly, hopefully, it'll be some progress on maybe identifying a way forward in Ukraine to at least end the fighting. But I think the critical one will be to prevent this more obvious division between developing and the developed world, which is can only get worse if it's not addressed this summit.
Okay, Vicky, as we sit here, it's easy for us to say if we don't do this and we need to do that. But what will it take when we get to September, to the main G20 summit, to achieve what Chris is talking about? Because, it's pie in the sky at the moment, isn't it?
Well, we're probably still going to have the war in Ukraine going on, and now people are expecting it to last for years. So I'm afraid that's going to dominate whether we like it or not. But it will require a huge amount between now and September of diplomacy from the West and loads of discussions, and ensuring also that some of those institutions that we've been talking about do the right thing, if you like, and support the countries, because there is a serious concern that, with debt levels as they are, we're going to have problems ahead. And if there isn't any guarantee, or at least greater satisfaction on the climate change issue, then that will also be a cause for concern. And then I think the West will find it difficult to ensure that the global South, if you like, stays with it.
Nikita, at this time of bitter global division, could India position itself as a potential mediator between the West and Moscow, using its leverage to do that?
I'm sure India is imagining itself in that position as the mediator, a world leader, a global South country, fifth largest economy in the world, which recently overtook its former colonial power, the UK, and is now ahead of it in terms of total GDP. But India must also look inside. So, there is the external posturing and the branding, and then there's internal constriction of democracy, opposition leaders being put in jail, student activists, journalists being put in jail, threatened with government institutions, all sorts of, false court cases. So while India is restricting its own democracy, it will be very hypocritical of it to posture as great world leader on the international stage. So it has a very good argument for multilateralism, understanding, consensus, but it also has to walk the talk internally.
Okay, and Chris, as we come to the end of the program, we've only mentioned China in passing. What about China's role in all of this? It also did not support the G20 joint declaration that we heard today.
Yeah, look, I think we're entering an interesting phase. As you have mentioned in your news in recent weeks, the Chinese foreign minister was in Europe as well as in Moscow a few weeks ago, talking about Chinese proposals for ending the war. We know that President Xi is planning to come to Europe and to Russia sometime in Q2. We don't know yet. So the Chinese have definitely kind of stepped up in terms of becoming a participant or an actor in trying to resolve the conflict. And I think that's what it will require. And I don't want to sound like an unreasonable optimist, but I think the G20 it offers at least some opportunity for some progress in at least coming to some sort of a ceasefire. I know it seems almost ridiculous to imagine that right now with what's happening every day. But if you like, the West has become, so supportive and so therefore so identified with Ukraine that Moscow therefore is not going to engage with the West directly in terms of how to end this conflict or even how to start the end of the conflict.
Okay.
China can't do it on its own because clearly its relationship with the US is broken and breaking. But therefore, I actually am looking at the G20 to see, is there an opportunity for the G20 to bring together all these different forces? Because I personally believe, from what I hear in Moscow, a big portion of the Russian government would like this to end, but they need an external intervention because they won't do it on their own.
All right. We'll have to leave it there. Do appreciate it. Thanks so much to all of our guests.
Special thanks to those who sent us tips via PayPal and to all our Patreon supporters. Their monthly donations of $5 and $12 really help us to keep going and plan our work. Thank you, friends. If you want to support us as well, you can find the links to our Patreon and PayPal in the notes to this episode. My name is Artem, and here is the news. For 372 days, Ukraine stands strong against the forces of the Russian invasion. According to the General Staff of Ukraine, overall Russian losses since the start of the full-fledged invasion exceeded 150,000 people, 3,300 tanks, 480 multiple-launch rocket systems and 300 aircraft. Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine Oleksiy Danilov said that Russian forces are losing 7 times more soldiers than Ukrainian forces on the Bakhmut front in the Donetsk region, reports Ukrainska Pravda. Yesterday morning, the governor of the Bryansk region of Russia said that a group of saboteurs from Ukraine entered the territory of the border region, opened fire at a car, as a result of which a local resident died and a child was injured, reports Suspilne. After that, the Russian security service, the FSB, said that armed Ukrainian nationalists who violated the state border are being neutralized in the region. Photos or videos that could confirm this have not been made public. At the same time, Russian President Vladimir Putin called the events near the town of Sushany in the Bryansk region a terrorist attack and cancelled the trip planned for yesterday. Ukrainian border guards stated that they have no information about the infiltration of the saboteurs into the territory of the Russian Federation and fully control the situation at the border. They also said that Russia may resort to provocations to discredit the defense forces of Ukraine. Meanwhile, the so-called Russian Volunteer Corps said that it was their fighters who entered the Bryansk region to show compatriots that free Russian people with weapons in their hands can fight the regime. They denied allegations about attacks on civilians. Russian Volunteer Corps is a military unit of the armed forces of Ukraine formed from volunteers with Russian citizenship. One of the fighters in the released video, Alexander, is a Russian who has been living in Ukraine since 2017 and joined the volunteer formation since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Spokesman of the Ukrainian military intelligence Andriy Yusov, referring to the video, said that the events in Bryansk region are a confrontation within Russia between citizens of Russia and evidence that the people of Russia are beginning to wake up. Later in the evening, the FSB of Russia announced that Ukrainian nationalists were forced into the territory of Ukraine and a massive artillery strike was launched against them. Russian MP Alexander Hishstein said that during the search for the saboteur group, a vehicle belonging to the National Guard of Russia exploded after triggering a mine, reports Hromadske. 4 National Guard personnel sustained minor shrapnel wounds. Hishstein shared a photo of another mine which he claimed was found near the site of the incident. Over 500,000 people were likely mobilized in Russia, despite the government's claim that no more than 300,000 people were called to serve, reports Kyiv Post. According to the investigation by the Russian outlet Mediazona, journalists were able to count the approximate number of mobilized based on the number of expedited registration of marriages in Russia. After the beginning of the mobilization in September 2022, the men who were mobilized were allowed to get married on an expedited basis instead of waiting for months. It gave their wives the right to government payments in case their husband dies at the front line. Thus, the marriage registration rate drastically increased in 2022 in comparison with the previous year. Mediazona counted an estimated number of mobilized men based on the information from 50 regions where almost 25,000 men who received military summons got married. After analyzing the information about the number of unmarried men of military age, the journalists came to the conclusion that nearly 240,000 men were enlisted in these regions, and nearly 525,000 men in total were summoned all over Russia. The expedited registration of marriages continued even after Vladimir Putin stated in October that mobilization has ended. The US is expected to announce another package of assistance for Ukraine on Friday, 3rd March, reports TSN UA. According to spokesman for the National Security Council of the White House, John Kirby, the package will include mostly ammunitions that the Ukrainians will need for the systems that they already have. He provided no further details. Ukraine is in the top 20 of influential countries in the world, according to the Global Soft Power Index, reports Interfax Ukraine. Over the past year, Ukraine added the most points among all countries, ranking 37th out of 121 countries in total and 19th in terms of influence. In terms of recognition, Ukraine has risen from 47th to 14th place. The reputation of Ukraine has shown a moderate improvement. The growth of the indicator is restrained by respondents from Asia who believe that the reputation of Ukraine has somewhat decreased. Ukrainian LGBT activist, founder of the Women's March, the head of NGO Insight, Olena Shevchenko, became one of Time's Women of the Year, reports NVUA. The editors of the magazine have traditionally chosen 12 women who have contributed to the protection of human rights this year. The authors of the rating call Olena one of the most recognizable human rights defenders in Ukraine. Olena Shevchenko is fighting for the most vulnerable sectors of the population of Ukraine, the publication says.
That's how long the U.S. Secretary of State spoke to his Russian counterpart recently, on the sidelines of an international gathering in India. The meeting was short, but noteworthy, because it was the first time the two had met since before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Countries around the world are eager to see a diplomatic solution to the war that has caused global disruptions. But as NPR's Michelle Kellerman reports, the U.S. remains skeptical.
India didn't want the war in Ukraine to dominate the G20 foreign ministers meeting, but Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Russia's actions have had ripple effects around the globe.
Every G20 member, and virtually every country, period, continues to bear the costs of Russia's war of aggression, a war that President Putin could end tomorrow if he chose to do so.
He says the U.S. wants a, quote, just and durable peace, and that means Russia has to pull out of Ukraine. But given that Russian President Vladimir Putin has failed to meet his objectives in Ukraine, he shows no signs he will walk away from the territorial gains he's made. And the Kremlin leader is still sounding rather confident, says Maria Snegovaya of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
He's doing well. He's quite confident that Russia is managing this conflict, and Russia has the capacity to sustain it for a while as the Western resources and Ukraine resilience, from his perspective, get exhausted.
So she doesn't see any real diplomatic prospects, at least until Russia faces even more severe losses on the battlefield and more financial losses from sanctions. But there are growing calls for diplomacy around the world, particularly from countries in the global south, hard hit by rising food and energy costs. That's understandable, says Marie Yovanovitch, a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine.
This war is a disaster for Ukraine on so many different levels, and frankly, it is for Russia as well. And so countries want that to stop.
But imagine, she says, there's a robber who invaded your home and took over several rooms.
And when the police are called and the police come in and the police say, in this case, the international community, well, the robber has possession of the lower part of your house. So, you really should make concessions to the robber and, we can all just move forward. From a Ukrainian point of view, this is completely unacceptable.
Yovanovitch says Ukraine has to win and Russia's, quote, imperial mindset needs to be defeated. She's skeptical about recent peace proposals from China, as is Lise Howard of the U.S. Institute of Peace.
It's not clear to me what would be negotiated at this point. Sure, if it's negotiating a Russian troop withdrawal, then that would make sense. As China said, sovereign borders need to be upheld. That's the first point in their peace plan. So it seems to me that if we uphold the first point of China's peace plan is to uphold sovereign borders, that would be a great negotiating point to start from.
U.S. officials say China is, quote, far from being an honest broker. It has supported Russia economically and diplomatically, as it did again in the G20 meeting, opposing a joint statement about the war in Ukraine. India, which hosted the meeting, could be in a better position to broker some kind of peace, says Anatol Levin of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He points out that India abstained from UN votes on Ukraine and has been a major importer of Russian oil and gas since the war began.
On the other hand, of course, India has influence in Washington because Washington is so anxious for India to become a partner against China. So I find India perhaps the most hopeful possibility.
He's not hopeful, though, of any peace process anytime soon, but he says as the world and the warring parties grow tired, there could be a, quote, provisional peace of exhaustion.